Hello and welcome back to What You Need to Know for Audio Engineers. In this video, we are going to go over the signal chain. All of our audio comes through this signal chain. So we're going to learn about how our signal chain affects instruments, microphones. We're going to see how our signal chain interacts with them. Here is our bank of instruments for our band. We've got our drums on a separate bank. We got our vocal microphones on another bank. We might visit all of these other banks in a little bit, but we're just going to stick with guitar number 4 right here because we're currently not using it for anything. So the very first thing we should look at is the top of the screen right here. We got the bank. That's what we're on right now. And we can select different banks and it will show us different instruments. That one's got nothing on it. There's our effects returns. There's our multi-tracks from Ableton. So we can select different banks, and if we have our bank tab selected, it will show us on the screen which bank we have selected. The next tab says Overview. So if we have a specific channel on our bank selected, and we have Guitar 4 selected right here, it's highlighted a little bit in light green. If we select Overview, we will get kind of a zoomed in view of that channel and all the processing on it. You can see Guitar 4 up in the top left corner. This is the signal chain. All the rest of the tabs across the top follow this order, from preamp to filter to gate to an insert. We'll talk about inserts later, to EQ to compression to another insert and a delay. First things first is the preamp. We can select the preamp tab across the top right here, and this will take us to the preamp. There's one very important thing about the preamp, and that is consistency. Every sound, every source needs to come in at the same level. Preamp gain equalizes and makes a consistent volume level for all of our instruments. But we also want to have the most possible signal to work with. So our goal and our target for setting the preamp is we want all of our channels to light up the very top light of our meters. You don't want it to be too high. You don't want it to be too low. You might be able to see and you might not be able to see because this is a laptop webcam that I'm shooting this on. There are numbers here. That looks like it says -20. That looks like it says -10. And this right here, it says +10. So there are numbers that we can shoot for that all of our signals can come into. Another important thing, with gain, something can happen called clipping. Clipping happens when a source is too loud and there's too much signal coming in. If there is too much signal coming in, then the signal will clip and it will sound crackly and distorted, and we don't want that because we want our signals to sound as they were intended to sound. On the preamp, as far as our controls, we have the actual gain that we can set. If we have an instrument like this guitar number 4, let's say it's peaking right here at -10, that means it can't get any louder than -10. That's the loudest it can possibly be with what the signal is coming in. Let's say if we want it to be +10, and that's our target, then if it's at -10, we have to increase our gain by 20 decibels. So we probably have to have it around 20 decibels to increase the input gain from -10, which is all that that guitar can send us, to +10, which is what we need it to be in order to be consistent with all of our other instruments. And this is a big deal because you don't want their peaking volume to be above the point of clipping. Our purpose of setting our preamp is to give us the most amount of signal possible without clipping, and also to be consistent. We want all of our channels to have that consistency, to be coming in at that same level. Another important control here is the 48 volts phantom power. You only want to turn on 48 volt power to something that needs it. There's almost nothing on our stage that needs 48 volts phantom power. There's only the condenser microphones on the front of the stage for the room. And the only other thing that we have that needs phantom power is our acoustic guitar DI. It's an active DI box. If I go to our acoustic guitar channel, you can see our 48 volts phantom power is on because it needs to be for that active DI to function. Another important function of the preamp is the pad. So if we engage the pad right here, see what happens. Our gain drops from 20 to 0. So this is a 20 decibel pad. It will reduce the incoming signal by 20 decibels. So if we have a signal coming in at +15 decibels and we want it to be at +10, but we can't turn our gain down any less, we have to use our pad right here, and we might have to attenuate that signal by -5 decibels so it goes from +15 to our target of +10 decibels. We also have the trim right here, which is like a digital gain. Preamps can sometimes introduce noise. There might be a defect in the preamp, but the trim is, theoretically, it's totally clean. It doesn't add anything that isn't already there. However, it is a little bit like zooming in to a JPEG on your computer. If you have a low quality JPEG and you want to zoom in and see some details, all you're going to see is pixels. A low quality image is a low quality image, and a low quality sound source is a low quality sound source. We can't make it sound any better, and we might actually highlight the low quality nature of it by using the trim. One more feature that you need to know about is the stereo image down here. If we have a stereo input, we can use left-right mode, or if we have a mono, you can use mono mode, and there's lots of other modes you can see there. We're not going to go over those for the sake of time. If you only have a mono acoustic guitar, you don't want to have them coming through a stereo channel, so you make sure that your channel is mono instead of stereo. Otherwise, you'll only ever hear them out of your right or left ear. The filter is another important thing. We want to use this to cut frequencies that we do not want in some of our sources. The high-pass filter is a filter which allows high frequencies to pass unimpeded. Right now it's set at 100 hertz, but we can raise that up to about 2 kilohertz. Everything below in this green area is being cut and is being reduced to infinity. And everything on the right side here in this area is not being cut at all. And usually we're going to have a high-pass filter somewhere around the 200 hertz, depending on the instrument. If it's a bass or the kick drum, our high-pass filter is going to be really low down here, around 50, maybe below 100 somewhere, because we really want the bass guitar and the kick drum to carry a lot of weight and a lot of low end. But if it's a guitar, we might bring it up to around 200, maybe it might even go up to 300. You want to make sure that those low frequencies coming from that guitar are not going to interfere with the bass and the drums, which are down in that area on this side of the green line. The low pass filter is the same thing, but the opposite. So I'm going to take my high pass all the way down, turn it off. Everything on the right side in that yellow area is being cut to infinity, and this can go all the way down to 20 hertz. Synthesizers use filters just like this all the time. Most of the things that we are using, we don't really need to cut these high frequencies unless it's like the bass guitar, and there's nothing in the bass guitar signal above 3 kilohertz. We might as well bring our low pass filter down to make sure that no extra hiss or static is in the signal in that yellow area right there. That's the purpose of the filter. The filter is to cut out things that we don't want or things that we don't need in a signal. The gate is a very important unit because it is an automatic volume control. Think of the gate in your side yard as opening and closing. Open it to allow someone to go through it. You close it to keep anyone from going in or out. An audio gate functions the same way. When it opens, your signal is allowed to pass through it. When it closes, your signal is kept from passing. So if we're thinking in the context of this guitar channel, there might be some hiss or some static or some sort of extra noise that's happening when the guitar player is not playing. But when they are playing, you can't hear all of that extra noise. But if that guitar player isn't playing for the first half of the song, you want to make sure that all that extra noise is not cluttering the sound of your mix before they actually start playing. So this is where a gate can help us. So if we engage our gate right here, the first thing and the most important thing is the threshold. Everything that is below the threshold will automatically be turned down. It will close the gate. And everything above opens the gate and allows the signal to pass. So if our guitar signal is peaking here at 0 decibels, maybe up to plus 10 decibels, where we have checked them at our preamp, but when they're not playing, there's this hiss that kind of lingers. So you'll see metering here and all that hiss. So you might have to set your threshold so that all of that hiss is below the threshold, but when they play, they're playing way up here. So that's way above the threshold. You can get into trouble with a gate if you set the threshold too high. So if we set the threshold up here, let's just put it at plus 10. If our guitar player is peaking at plus 8 when they're playing normally, they're probably going to be below that threshold of plus 10. So their volume is going to be reduced and can sound very unnatural and make the guitar player unhappy because your gate is automatically turning them down when they're supposed to be playing and contributing to the music. You only want it to act on parts of the signal that you don't want to be there. If you set it too low, let's say you put it here right here at minus 55 or so, but you have all this extra hiss that's coming in and peaking at minus 40, that's above the threshold, so your gate isn't going to ever close, and you're always going to have that extra hiss. So you find the right threshold, And let's say that the right threshold for our guitar is right around minus 30 decibels. Below that is just noise, and above that is their playing. The next thing on the gate is the depth. When you have signal below the threshold, the gate closes, and it will be reduced by this number of decibels. So this is being reduced at the maximum by 60 decibels when our signal is below the threshold. Or we can set that depth much more subtly. So let's say we set it's around 10. So it's being reduced by 10 decibels when our signal is below the threshold. So that's a lot more subtle. The more drastic you set your depth, the more important it is that your threshold is in the right place for that source. We have the attack. So the attack is how quickly the gate will close when your signal drops below the threshold. And you can make it really slow, or you can make it really fast. Making it too fast might sound unnatural. You might get some clicks or some pops. You'll hear that drastic volume change, especially if your depth is very drastic. If you set it too slow, you might not get any reduction at all because it is turning down too slowly and the player starts playing again. And then the gate opens back up, and then your gate hasn't done anything because it didn't close fast enough. Then your hold is like a delay after your signal drops below the threshold. How long is it going to wait before it starts to close? Faster, it will close immediately. Or if you have it slower, probably go like 5 seconds. So 5 seconds after your signal drops below your threshold, the gate will start to close. Usually that's too long to be worth anything. You want it to sound natural. Again, it depends on the instrument that you're gating. Release is how fast will the gate open when your signal goes above the threshold. And the longer this will go pretty long again, 1 whole second. The gate will take a very long time to open. So if it's your pastor and he takes a pause to take a drink of water, his signal drops below the threshold, but then he starts talking again, and then it takes a whole second for his voice to open the gate. And that can sound really unnatural, very distracting. You'll set it differently for voices than you will for a drum, than you will for a guitar. It totally depends on what source you are working with. And that's where, again, virtual sound check is important because you can actually practice with this stuff and see how it acts and how it interacts with different instruments. Now, how does the gate interact with all of the other things? Think about your filter. If we have our filter set here at 300 hertz, if we have our low pass filter set around 2.6 kilohertz, everything on the outside of those green and yellow zones, that's all being cut out of the signal. Let's say we have tons of bass happening out here and we don't have a high pass filter engaged. Well, all of that signal is coming into our channel, especially if it's a microphone. If we have all this extra signal that is coming in, then that might raise our signal here at the gate above the threshold. So our gate might not ever close for the quiet parts because there's all this extra bass. But as soon as you go back and you turn your filter on, all of that bass is cut out, and then suddenly the threshold actually works the way that you want it to on your gate. The next part of our signal chain is an insert. You can insert something else from outside of the signal chain into the signal chain at this point. So that can be an effect. It could be something like a de-esser for a vocal, but the insert is just a place where you can insert whatever you want into the signal chain. If you are inserting something and you don't know how it's going to affect the rest of your signal chain, you might get some unpredictable results. So you want to be careful about what you're using your inserts for. The only thing that we are using inserts for is our vocal channels. I can go to our vocal group right here. We have an insert on that. And of course, our vocal channels have those de-essers that I was talking about. Those are inserted in those insertion points. The next thing after that is the EQ. We can see on the EQ, our filter is still showing up. And if we go to our filter, we turn those off, we can see that those are showing up. We don't really ever want to be doing any EQ without knowing about where our filter is set. So if we have a signal and we want to have some extra bass come in, but let's say that our high pass filter is set right here at that 300 hertz point. Well, if we want to boost some bass, we're never going to be able to boost because all of that bass is being removed from the signal by the filter before it. If we want to boost the bass of a signal, we have to make sure that our high pass filter is not going to interfere with it. But of course, there's very few things that we actually want to add bass to. It's very easy to have too much bass in the mix. All right, so let's turn off our filter again and let's talk about this EQ. So this row of knobs down here are the controls for each of our bands. These little, you can see it, that little bell curve right there. So there are 4 of these little places in the mix. I'm going to move these filters out of the way so that they're not visually in the way. We have these 4 bands of EQ. Every single one of these is a volume knob. Basically, it's a volume control for frequency ranges. So we have our low frequency band right here. So we can boost bass or we can cut bass. And we can change the width of that. And I'm going to move our middle out of the way right here. We can change the width of it. We can make it super wide so that we're boosting or cutting lots of bass like that. So it's a bigger bell curve. Or we can make it a really narrow band of frequencies. Maybe there's a resonant frequency right there. You can see that resonant frequency right there of my voice, and I can just pull that out if I wanted to, if it's too much. So we have a width control, we have a volume control, and also we can change the frequency, hone in on a specific frequency. Let's say we have 150 hertz that is really sounding bad in our acoustic guitar, which actually is relevant to us in our acoustic guitar in this room. So we might go to 150 hertz, make it a little bit more narrow, and cut those frequencies out so that those frequencies are not overpowering the sound of the guitar itself. EQ, that's short for equalization. The purpose of our EQ is to equalize the sound of each source. So if a source has too much bass, we need to remove bass. If it has not enough mid-range, we need to add mid-range. So we might have to come in here in the mid-range and give that a nice boost if there's not enough mid-range in the source. Or if there's a really harsh frequency somewhere up here around 10 or 15K, we might have to come up there and cut it out to keep that harshness out of the signal, because certain frequencies in different instruments and different voices can be overpowering. And usually that overpowering sound comes out to sounding very unnatural. So if you had a person standing in front of you talking, you know that that sounds totally natural because they're standing in front of you talking. And the EQ is one of the biggest tools that we can use that can help us make a more natural sound. Typically, if we have a voice, well, I'll just show you the microphone that I'm speaking into right now. So this is the EQ that's on my voice right now. And if I turn all of this EQ and filters off, you will hear what that does to the sound of my voice. And you can hear how much extra bass that is there. Part of that is being fixed by the high pass filter here. And you can hear what that does. That cuts out lots of extra bass. But now there's this kind of boxy, muffled sound in there. So the EQ is helping to fix that. And you can see as soon as I activate that, suddenly there's so much more clarity in my voice. And, we'll have the low pass filter to keep, extra noises coming out from the very, very high frequencies. That's the goal for a lot of our instruments. But there's another purpose that EQ can serve. We can think about our mix of our band as happening in different zones. So we can have our low frequency zone down here, and usually that's where the drums are. We can have a low mid frequency zone right here, and that might be where our guitars and our keyboards are. We have another zone over here, this high mid frequency zone. That's where our vocals really are. And then we have our high frequency zone up here. This is where all of the details of all of the instruments and all of the voices really comes through. Each of those zones we want to reserve for what belongs in it, if you think of it that way. So really in this low frequency zone down here, we want to save that and reserve that space for the bass and the drums, really low frequency stuff that we want to exist there. And we really don't want much else to have any existence in that space. So for a guitar, if we don't want there to be all this extra bass in our guitar and we want to save that space for the bass and the drums, we're going to use our filter to cut out all the extra bass from the guitar channels and from the vocal channels and maybe from the keyboard channels as well. We want to save that space for what belongs there. If we have our guitars and keyboard instruments living here, it might be the acoustic guitar and the piano. Let's just think of it that way. We have those acoustic guitars and pianos living in this area right here. We don't want to have the drums interfering in this mid-range zone right here. So the drums are probably going to have lots of cuts in this area so that they're not going to interfere with the piano and the acoustic guitar. They're not going to do this thing called masking. When you have masking, you have instruments that are covering up other instruments so you can't hear them. You can use EQ to carve out the space in the mix for each of the instruments that you want to fit in each zone. And that's a very, that's a very rudimentary, rough example with, this is where your bass and your drums are, or this is where your pianos and keyboards are, or this is where your vocals are. Every mix is different. It depends on who the people are and what the band is and what their instruments are and how do they sound. Everybody's going to fit into a different place. So you just have to find everybody's place, and EQ is one of the ways that you do that. And now let's move on to the next part of the signal chain, the compressor. The compressor is another multi-use tool. EQ is also another kind of multi-tool. It does lots of different things, and we can use it for different jobs. And the compressor is the same way. But let's talk about what it does and how it functions first. The first thing is the threshold. We're already familiar with how the threshold works because we know how the threshold works in the gate. The difference is that here, everything above the threshold is activating the compressor, and everything below the threshold does not activate the compressor. We also have an attack and release time here. So the attack is how quickly the compressor will engage after the signal is above the threshold. Release is how quickly it will disengage after the signal drops below the threshold. We have a ratio, so this has to do with something called gain reduction. This ratio of 3:1 means for every 3 decibels of signal that comes above the threshold, only 1 decibel of signal will come out. So it will reduce the signal by 2 decibels if you only have 3 decibels above the threshold. But if you have 6 decibels above the threshold, 2 decibels will come out. If you have 12 decibels, you get the idea. So you have this ratio of gain reduction, and the higher above the threshold you go, the more reduction you get. That is what the compressor does. That is how it functions. It is controlling how loud can an instrument get, or how loud can a voice get. If we have our guitar player and they're playing nice, quiet cowboy chords on the verse, but then for the chorus, they turn on a boost pedal and they turn on an overdrive and a delay, and they have all this extra sound coming through. If we don't have the compressor on, they can quickly overpower the sound of the rest of the band. So we can use a compressor for that guitar player to make sure that their signal never gets so loud that they overpower anything. And we do that for everything. So if we're thinking about zones for the mix, frequency ranges that all the instruments live in, you can also think about volume ranges and where does this instrument fit in the mix volume-wise? Where do I need them to stay? So you can use the compressor to help you control that. The last main control in the compressor is the makeup gain. If you reduce the gain of an instrument or of anything using the compressor, the effect is that it can sound quieter than it actually is. So you would match the sound of the compressor when it's on and when it's off. So when you turn the compressor on, you want the volume to be the same as when you turn the compressor off. So it's a great tool, but again, you have to come in with virtual sound check or come to rehearsal and actually practice these things, get your hands on it and see, how do I actually want to use this for vocals? How do I want to use it for guitars? How do I want to use it for the drums? It can do so many different things that it's really a little bit too much to talk about in a video like this. But that is how it functions. And a great way to think about using it is with the EQ, you think about frequency ranges where certain instruments should exist. And in your compressor, you think about certain volume ranges in which those instruments should exist. You want your vocals to be the loudest thing, but you don't want them to get so loud that, people's ears start hurting. So you use the compressor to set the maximum volume for your vocals. And how does the compressor interact with everything that comes before it? Say you have your EQ and you have a really mid-range heavy instrument, and there's so much mid-range in that instrument that all of that mid-range is here peaking above the threshold of your compressor. So your instrument is coming in way above your threshold because there's all this extra mid-range in your EQ. But if you go in, you say you just put this in the middle somewhere here, and we take all that mid-range out, suddenly there's not as much signal coming into the compressor. So your signal might not reach above the threshold as drastically, and it might not reduce the gain as much. So EQ and compression, I'm always thinking about how those two are interacting with each other, and the same with the filter. So let's just turn on our filter and bring it up somewhere ish there. So if we have all this extra sound below this 200 hertz that we're cutting out, then it's not possible for that to trigger our compressor with all that extra sound. So hopefully that explains it a little bit. Again, it's different for every instrument, how you want to use the compressor, how you set the compressor. It all depends on the individual instrument, and you have to use virtual sound check. You have to come and get your hands on it to be able to get an idea for how that works. And it's just going to take time to practice, just like learning an instrument. It's going to take you time. You're not going to be able to pick up the guitar on your first day and be able to play anything. It's like learning your G chord and your C chord on your guitar. Well, you learn your EQ and your compressor on your signal chain, and it's kind of the same thing. You learn how those things work. You learn how they interact with each other, and then you can use them in a song. After our compressor comes another insert, and again, whatever you put in this insert is affected by everything that came before it. One place where we use inserts on this very last insert right here is in our microphones. We have a de-esser on insert B. So after all of our processing, we have a de-esser, and this is just another kind of compressor that reduces super high sibilant frequencies, or kind of really sizzly, harsh, high frequency that's there. And the de-esser is here to reduce that so that you can still hear the S and you can still hear the T. You can still hear what word they're speaking, what they're saying, but those S's and T's and sibilant frequencies are not going to jump out and sound super harsh or unbalanced. It is all about balancing, and this is just another tool that we use to do that. We don't have anything in any of the inserts on any of our instruments or channels except for the vocal microphones. The very last thing in the signal chain is a delay, and this is something that we don't ever use because there's no reason to. Let's say I'm speaking right now. I can delay how long it's going to take for my voice to come out of the speakers in the room. Of course, that can be very disorienting. If it's your pastor and he says something and there's a delay on his voice, it's going to be very off-putting to him. It's going to be very difficult for him to speak naturally. The delay, it does have its uses. It doesn't have any use for us. So of course, nothing in here is being delayed. But there we go. There is our signal chain. All of our instruments, all of our mics follow the same signal chain. Why don't we look at a couple different ones? So let's go to our overview screen. Let's go to our piano channel right here. You can see that there's some different settings on the gate. There's a different setting on the compressor. You can see the compressor settings over here. You can see a different EQ. And then if we go over to our bass guitar, completely different EQ, completely different settings in the compressor and the gate and the filters. Let's go to our singer's microphone. This is a singer microphone. You can see how much bass is being cut out of there. You can see how much of the low-mid frequencies is being cut, see where the filter is, see where the compressor and the gate are set. All of this stuff is different, and you can tailor every single instrument with every single part of your signal chain if you choose to. If you have a full band, let's say we've got our drummer, bass player, and acoustic guitar player, 2 electric guitar players, keyboard player, and we have 4 vocalists on stage, well, there's definitely not enough time to set every single compressor and every single EQ and every single filter for every single person in the band. That's why virtual sound check is so helpful for us. It helps us to streamline our Wednesday practices, our Wednesday rehearsals, keep them short, and it helps us to get the band in and out. They can learn the songs, they can learn how their parts are working and how they want their ears set in their IEMs. They can get all that stuff figured out, and then after rehearsal, we can dial in the EQs and dial in the compressors and dial in all of the filters, and we can figure out how we want to do all that processing, and the band doesn't have to be standing up there waiting for us to do that. So virtual sound check, it's a very important tool and one that we use every week here.